Derek, you were going to tell us about your experience with het cattle predominantly, which is...
well, okay. I'll tell you about my experience with het cattle. There's been an awful lot of talk about it. Does everybody know what het cattle are? Does everybody not know what het cattle are? Right, okay, everybody knows what they are.
Just do a 2-minute summary. I think that'd be helpful. Right,
okay. In the run-up to the Second World War, two brothers, Lutz and Heinz Heck, who were eminent German zoologists but were also members of the Nazi Party, espoused a view that if you had a species which was extinct in the wild, or extinct, that if its domestic descendants were still on the go, the genes were present, although the wild species were present in the domestic descendants, and therefore you could rewild them. You could basically deselect for the characteristics that the domestic cattle had been developed for, be it milk or beef, and you could produce an animal that was the aurochs. Okay, they were great liars. They were also great storytellers. And at the end of the day, they produced an animal which in their mind's eye, looked like the animal of the old German sagas, which looked like the cave paintings, which breeds in a very variable way. And then they did things like, they went to Yalavisa, and they took the horses that the Poles had been breeding back to forest horses there, away from the horse enclosures, and they took het cattle and they let them go in the forest. And they were seen in their time as an example of Nazi domination, of lies and trickery, and it is a miracle that any of these animals survived the Second World War at all, because as the armies came from the east, they were not liked. But some of them did. They survived in game parks and zoos, and for quite some considerable time there has been a debate about their utility as nature conservation grazers. They're certainly quite entertaining animals to look at, and if you select them, you can end up with animals that look very similar to cave paintings. From a skeletal point of view, they're very variable. They're quite a bit smaller than aurochs were. There is a program in Europe involving a number of different organisations and individuals who are now reselecting these animals using mainly Spanish draft cattle to create an animal that mimics the skeletal structure and the horn structure of the aurochs much more exactly. And some of those really are quite splendid looking creatures. There are none of those in Britain at the moment. A couple of years ago we imported a herd of these animals for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust at Slimbridge. They decided ultimately they didn't want to have them, and we were left with approximately, I think, about 13 or 14 of them, plus calves and a number of bulls, and we had to find homes for them. Now, there's been considerable debate in nature conservation circles about, whether they should be brought here, whether they shouldn't be brought here, whether they're an asset or not. The animals that we had in part came from a Belgian nature conservation organisation, kind of like the Wildlife Trust, and in part from the Dutch nature conservation organisation, the Statutory Nature Conservation Organisation Staatsbosbeheer. So some of the animals came from over Flacquet, from the Scheldt estuary, and had never been handled at all before by people, and had been basically driven into corrals by tractors with gates, welding to the front and all this sort of stuff. As far as we were concerned, those animals were unworkable. We just could. They were incredibly dangerous. They would attack you if you went into the field with them. I've worked with different animals at bison and bison zoos. Never worked with anything like this, and it was only a matter of time until they either killed somebody or we shot them. Ultimately, Edinburgh Zoo said they wanted them, and Edinburgh Zoo got them, but they knew what they were getting, and they were not animals that were manageable. The animals that we have kept are the animals from that herd that were calm and quiet, and that you could work with in the same way you can work with conventional domestic cattle, and we still have a small herd of them, half of which this year went to a nature conservation grazing project on the outskirts of the New Forest, on a private estate there. They'll be built up, and there will be a grazing component on that man's private land in sort of like wet woodland areas. Are they any better than any other native cattle as far as nature conservation is concerned, grazing is concerned? Probably not. They're probably no better than Galloways or Longhorns or Highlands or anything else. They're very tough, they're very hardy, they have little in the way of a commercial market other than probably nature conservation grazing. Maybe you could develop some sort of speciality beef market for them, but that would be hard work. And really that's it. I don't have anything else to say about het cattle. I mean, we've got a few of them. They are, part of what we do now, but we keep them a separate part of the farm. The bull's a bit of a pain in the arse because if it's anywhere near the commercial bulls, it's got horns and they have not. So it tends to rip up the fences a bit. But that's it. They're really no great trouble now, and yes, we have a few het cattle.
How does the agri-environmental payment schemes?
We get no money for the animals we keep. We're not in an HLS area. We're not an HLS.
Right.
We can't get into it. The HLS has no money, so we get no subsidy for keeping animals like this.
It'd be really interesting in your perspective. I'm hoping to lead a walk at 1:30 just to show people the Longhorns here. We had a big debate about what breed of animal to stick in the forest, and as you well highlighted there, for us it was between Galloway, Longhorn, Highland, something really tough, robust, that could cope with bramble, sedges, all sorts. The key reason we went for the Longhorn was because of its docile nature. We've had some bad experience with belted Galloway, particularly with cyclists, where they've got calves and they defend their calves, very well. And the Longhorns have been, we touch wood, we haven't had any major issues, despite their impressive headwear. We've had no major issues with dogs, and for us in the forest estate, the people interaction is really, really important.
Yeah.
The other thing for us with the Longhorn is, I'm biased, but I'm still convinced it's the best tasting steak I've ever had. It takes 3 years to get to maturity, which is, from a farming perspective, too long. That's why they've gone out of fashion. But they're fantastic mothers, they calve easily, and we're hoping to get a premium market for the Longhorn. It's interesting, your comment about the grazing. I mean, one of the things I'll be very interested in people's comments on, but this is the nonsense of trying to achieve some of these things in the real world. We wintered our cattle with another farm this year for all sorts of reasons, with part of the herd, and unfortunately that farmer had a TB scare. Hadn't had TB for 8 years, and he had a TB scare, which meant that our animals were locked up effectively because they had some interaction with the others. So the Longhorns were locked up. We've only literally been able to introduce the Longhorns back into the forest in 6 of the 7 grazing units in the last month. The bramble has, in that time, ran away. So we will almost certainly have to do quite a degree of manual intervention. And it's getting this balance right. There are all sorts of things that unfortunately come up that you're not expecting. But I'm just interested that, I guess we were hoping, it is amazing what the Longhorns will eat. But nothing will eat woody, bramble, and really aggressive scrub growth if it's got other, and because it's a breeding herd, we have to be really, really careful on welfare grounds. We cannot push these animals too hard, which you can perhaps do with non-breeding, but then you get into some dodgy territory. I think there is a case for traditional breeds where there is a market for their value, their meat. But I have to say, at the moment, we're hoping that we go into HLS this year. All the signs are that we are, and we'll get the native breed supplement. But I've seen the business plan, and unless something changes pretty radically, it's going to be hard to make our herd cost-effective, totally viable in 10 years. And that's our target, and that's with a totally subsidised payment on the herd. It is totally artificial. This is my problem with it at the moment. Managing extensive cattle grazing on the sort of scale we're talking about, single sucklers, however high you charge for the beef, the job at the moment don't work. And my challenge has been to try to see if there's a model we can come up with that actually makes this a viable business, and it's really hard to do. Really hard.
That's a lot. It is, and the point you made, again, when people talk about using things like this, the point with regard to human access is a very important one. In Holland, as far as I can recall, it's something like 98%, certainly a very high percentage of state forests that have to be open to people and recreation. So if there's something like the Oostvaardersplassen, it's a very unusual project, and you can't walk through the main reserve there because at the end of the day, the cows and calves are very dangerous. When they've got little calves, they will go for you, and they're bloody fast, and they'll kill you. If they have a chance, they would kill you. So at the end of it all, what would these be? I think these would be difficult in an area where you had human access, not because they're particularly aggressive as individuals, but certainly when they have calves, they would take dogs very badly, and they might take people very badly. And that makes it hard, because you're then looking at small areas of land where you can graze them. You have to move them about these small areas of land. You've got all the issues of movement licenses and TB that you've just highlighted, and it's really difficult. And one of the other things I didn't mean to say earlier on was you were talking about your colleague in Bavaria, and I don't know what kind of conversations you've had with them, but interestingly, when we talked to one of the social scientists there a couple of years ago, he said after the Second World War there was a huge green movement in Germany, and that green movement was very keen on reintroductions, and that green movement was involved in the state government and all sorts of different levels. And he said, and there were ambitious plans to, right, okay, reintroduce the beaver. They reintroduced the beaver in the 1960s, reintroduced the lynx. Well, there was an unofficial lynx reintroduction whereby people who were very enthusiastic kept bred cats and let them go. And then lynx eventually came across the border from the Czech Republic, so they didn't reintroduce them. But if you go down to Bavaria, you're living in a landscape where every so often wolves come across. 3 or 4 years ago, a bear came across from Austria. Every so often from the Czech Republic, you get moose coming across into the landscape. And there are absolutely no plans now at all. There is no will and no enthusiasm to reintroduce anything else. Because, to give you an example of something like a moose, when you cross the Czech Republic, it's like going back in the border of the Czech Republic from Bavaria. It's like going back in time to a landscape that was there prior to the world wars. Huge areas of wetland, huge areas of forest, ranching cattle on a substantial scale. It doesn't look like anything that's on the other side of the border 8 miles away. And when the moose come across, what happens is they find, if they're lucky and they survive long enough, is they find tiny patches of wetland environment through an intensively utilised landscape with very many roads and very many people, and they inevitably always end up getting killed on the roads or getting killed in the motorway. And when the family driving their VW whatever hits a moose doing 90 miles an hour on the autobahn, it kills everybody in the car, and it probably kills many other people as their car spins out of control, and it's complete political poison.
But on that point, you've got so many deer vehicle collisions in Britain already,
Sure.
and that costs the economy £30 million a year. So there's a flip side to that as well, isn't there?
There is, and I mean, and the politics in Bavaria are more interesting still, because of course the hunters' lobbies, which demand the deer. So the deer situation there is very different. The deer that you find in the valley bottoms are roe deer. Roe deer were an animal that was designated by Hermann Göring to be the small man's trophy red deer, because there weren't enough red deer to go round, and the big hunters were the guys that were going to kill the red deer, and the little guys were the guys that were going to kill the roe deer. And so that's where this whole affection for roe deer started. It started with somebody who was, had the environmental credentials of Hermann Göring. And it's still there. So if that's something like your lynx interaction, one of the reasons why the lynx are a real bugbear for the hunters is that the roe deer in the lowland farmed environment and the lower reaches of the mountains are very carefully looked after. So you'll find right the way through the landscape there are shooting seats everywhere, and there are mangers everywhere. So they're going to get beet tops, they're going to get concentrates, they're going to get hay, because the animals, all these little guys want to get trophy medal heads from. So of course the deer come to the feeding stations, and the problem with lynx is that lynx are smart, is that they come to the feeding stations too. So they'll sit on top of the feeding stations waiting for the next roe deer to come along. They're not interested in whether it's got a trophy medal head or not, they don't care. And all they want to do is eat another roe deer. And because they kill and they keep on coming, you kill one today, one tomorrow, one the day after that, they can have a significant impact on roe deer because of the artificial human situation that we created to support roe deer.
But that wouldn't happen here, Derek.
It wouldn't happen here, but there it's a massive, politically powerful culture. And here, we've had the lynx debate, but when it comes to sort of going back to introducing an animal that wanders through the countryside, it's the size of a cow. It just out with fence theories, it won't happen, because at the end of the day you'll have this as a problem. And okay, red deer are here, and we had a couple down the road from us who were building converting a church, and they ran into a red deer, and both of them were killed. I don't know, maybe because it's always happened, there's a degree of acceptance with regard to it, but it's another thing altogether to introduce a much, much bigger animal, into an environment that's bigger than a cow, and say, well, hey, it's not going to be a problem. Of course it's going to be a problem.
What is the trend of conservation? What are the sort of top two breeds the conservation managers are using for conservation grazing at the moment? Just depends on circumstances and whether it needs to be docile because there's public access. And so they'll go.
Galloway's conic ponies, a bit of Exmoor pony. Galloway's in Ennerdale. Longhorns are in Longhorn.
Well, aren't conics an issue if you've got public access to a place?
No, they're very calm. The only problem
We
with
saw
them
a
is
lady remonstrating with people in Holland for trying to feed one.
It's if people start to feed them, and when you start to feed them, they get pushy. And when they get pushy, they can become quite bitey. But the only problem, the guys in Holland, if you recall, that Hans was saying was the only time they ever had a serious injury with a conic horse was when somebody tried to put their kid on its back, and the kid got a fracture of skull. But I mean, this is a horse that had never been ridden before, and you think, oh, this is a tribute to the stupidity of our parents. But you know, you can easily get sued for that sort of thing.
Just to put things in perspective, a lifelong friend of mine was killed on the outskirts of Cardiff by a bull 3 weeks ago. She'd been walking a new dog, and the dog got kind of out of control. She didn't know there was a bull in the field. There was a number of other cattle in the field, and she was found dead. So there are risks, you know, with domestic cattle. Even sheep have been known to kill people.
I can't remember the exact agricultural statistics are now, but the last time I looked, it was something like 30 people had been killed in a given year by sheep, and it's hundreds of people that are killed every year by cattle. But then there are a lot of cattle kept, and a lot of the cattle breeds that are kept, you know, we talk about docility, but you know, if you mentioned Longhorns, we mainly keep beef shorthorns. And beef shorthorns are lovely, quiet cows. When they calve, you can go in beside them, you can twin calves onto them. They are never, ever it's very highly unlikely they will ever attack you. Then you try and do that with a blonde Aquitaine or a Charolais. Yeah. And Christ, those are dangerous cattle. But then you have commercial value, you have a culture that you know, as you say, you go through agricultural, exact quick finish, you know, it hits all your targets for under 30 months, and people are used to dealing with them, and that's the way it works. Nobody thinks it's unusual.
The motivation for your private landowner who took some heck in the New Forest, that was just because it's iconic and he's got the money and he's prepared to manage them.
He is a very wealthy man. They own a very big estate, which is mainly an arable estate. So I mean, they have a lot of corn and they have a lot of potatoes. They have a contract with Walker's Potato Crisps for. In the valley bottoms, he is in HLS because there's a lot of willow carn and they are very biodiverse. And he uses a mixed cattle grazing herd, and he is interested in natural history. He's quite young, and he had read some stuff on the internet about them, and he just decided he wanted to have those ones. So it was a complete whim.
So he's got the money to back it up.
He's got the money to back it up. Yeah.
And he has, what kind of fencing is he?
Just ordinary fencing. They're not bad animals with guard fences. Not unless you've got another bull somewhere in the vicinity, and then the bull will put its horns into the fence, and it'll eventually wreck the fence in a very short period of time. But then a Highland would do that, or a Longhorn would do that as well.
And notices to the public about danger?
You don't need any notices.
They have got signs in that saying.
Oh, NEP has, yes.
You're not talking about that, sorry.
No, I'm saying, if you're asking whether you need to tell people, you know, the domestic cattle, you don't need to have anything. They don't have any DWA designation or anything like that. So you don't have to put signs up. I mean, it would not be a smart idea to put them on a footpath. That's what you were saying. In NEP, all the notices, yes, there are notices the entrance to NEP for everything, I think,
yes.
in the pigs. But he's got loads of footpaths running through there. And one of the reasons why Charlie has not brought in head cattle and will not have bison and things like that is because there's so many footpaths. And won't even have red deer there because of the footpaths.
I think there's quite a few local people around NEP who are slightly surprised about what he's doing and why. There's parts of the river or something that have been grazed for hundreds of years, and they're questioning why he's doing it. I don't think he consulted any of the local residents about his plans particularly.
Well, if you asked him, I mean, I saw him last week, and if you asked him, and I've quite a bit to do with him, he would tell you he did.
Okay.
And he went to incredible trouble to explain it. But you asked about the balance sheet for that. It is the only large-scale project, rewilding project, that is in Britain to date, full stop. And he has done this on his land and the land of his family for a variety of different reasons. One is, from an economic point of view, he could make any money from farming. It didn't matter what they tried to do. It's on fairly hard soil from an arable point of view, so it doesn't matter how much you chuck at it, sooner or later you're running out of time. So you could make a go of it from an arable farming point of view, you could make a go of it from a dairy point of view, you could make a go of it from any other point of view there was. But if you basically rewilded the whole area and got £500,000 from Natural England for, under the auspices of HLS and considerable grant assistance to put up all the perimeter fences, and you finished all your farm tenancies, so all your tenant farmers were basically no longer there, and then you invested money into the farmyards and houses that this released, and you created workshops for a diversity of different commercial producers, so for people like ships chandlers to whatever else. You had this small business, what had been a farm became a small business unit. Then the overall employment that's generated is massive. It's 60% greater employment than was there before. But the problem for the local community is that old Fred, whose father and great-grandfather and everybody else who'd worked for the estate, old Fred's redundant, and old Fred's got nothing to do, and he has no role or function in that. And that didn't go down very well.
And also just experiencing it, despite all of that, so there's some winners and losers in the transformation of it. But environmentally, ecologically, it does feel like an island. That's the estate, and the rest of it is just the blasted out lowland countryside.
But then again, I think this comes back to what we're looking to actually achieve in a landscape. I mean, if you look at Osfar Responsible, okay, they have got some money to expand out towards Horsterville. They will not have the money at this stage or in the foreseeable future to expand out to the Veluwe. But it's still an island. It's an island in an intensively used landscape. But the huge advantage of it is that if you have, and something like Nep's a cracking example, is you have these areas of abandonment where scrub takes over very quickly. Within 4 or 5 years, you're driving through fields that were corn, and there's willow that's probably 20 foot high, growing around you. Then you look at the number of singing nightingales there are, turtle doves, small birds. The whole area is alive with birds. So for a guild of species, it is phenomenally good, and it creates this kind of nature dynamo which just chucks life out.
Yeah. And you can learn from it, see it for real.
And I think, just spinning on from that, my justification in part for what we've done here is the fragments of butterfly habitat that we had before that were being managed by hand by butterfly conservation were completely unviable in the long term. Great they were doing it, but hopefully we've created a habitat that is, to use the dreaded terminology, sort of climate proof, that is going to be robust in a time of changing climate. But it's still an island.
Yes.
It's just a bigger island.
I'm not denying islands. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying it's they are. We've got to recognise that the circumstances which.
I think it'd be a real shame if your rewilding projects, and I'm sure they're not, but it would be a real shame if they are just playthings of rich people or little tiny sort of areas that have to have all sorts of fencing around them because that's the only way they'll work. It's got to be looked at that reconnected landscape scale. Which
policy learns from practice, though. Sometimes you need some demonstrations, even from the eccentric reasons they've happened, to inform policy.
Yes, but we're not after ghettos. It's only a stepping stone.
But what is interesting here in the Roche is that you've got such a sharp contrast between what's happening in the forest and what's happening in this field.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what the scope is for. I mean, is that dairy farm viable in the long term?
No, apparently it's. I was told yesterday that he's having a dispersal sale next week.
Right.
And the simple answer to that is no.
So is there a potential for a kind of net-like solution to some of the fields within the Naroche?
What we're doing is sort of creeping onto the walk a bit, but we have a project called Beef and Butterflies, which we hope was going to get special project funding from Natural England until that was drawn out. But we have managed to get funding for it, which is really looking at alternative solutions to agri-environment, because there is no more HLS in this area. So that's out of the question. But I think marginal land, we do have quite a bit of marginal land on the outskirts of the forest that at the moment is a bit of a headache to the farmer, where if you've got the right grazing in there with our longhorns, there's the scope. So yes, the whole aim of that project is to actually use a local farmer who's got a good reputation locally, so he's already got street cred, with an understanding what we're doing, to look at cooperative grazing and that sort of thing. But if you took this scenario here where we are now, if I was owning this bit of land, this is quite valuable silage ground. you've got to pay me a lot of money to abandon it. And I think if we took where we camped for the last few days, it's difficult to see how you avoid that hard edge, because the only way at the moment to achieve it is to bribe the farmer to pay for lost. This would be a key part of his winter fodder to keep the dairy farm going.
If the dairy farm wasn't going, there'd be potential to have a flower-rich meadow and a bit of encroaching scrub as it met with the Longhorn expanded into that area.
I think it probably would be if the farmer was getting £250 a hectare for doing it.
Right.
And this is the real problem, is all the time is what is the commercial driver for this? Because when the last time we went to NEP, I had the area representative for the NFU there, old man, courteous man, very pleasant guy, came politely around the tour that we did with everybody else. And I was sitting having a chat with him at the back of the tractor trailer, and he said, it's great, it's all very well, but he said basically it's not a model you can roll out in any other way. It just doesn't stack up, because there isn't, Natural England don't have the resources to run any more of these, and it's from a commercial farming point, how would you do it? And what you do find for farmers is you have all this talk of ecosystem services, purer water, blocking grips and holding water, but there's no driver to create a situation whereby they're financially rewarded for doing it. So why in the name of God would you? Okay, some people will have a social responsibility, and a few individuals will act responsibly because of that. But for the vast majority, you're asking them to forgo an income, in a commercial climate, which is not very easy anyway, and unstable. And why would you do it?
What about a model where, in a few situations, like here, instead of there being a farmer within the small businessman, independent businessman model, he was an employee of a forestry division. So he was a government employee. So he didn't have to go through that sort of profit loss.
It's funny because I think one of the reasons we've been able to do what we've been able to do here in Naroche predominantly has been that we manage 1,000 hectares within a 10,000 hectare landscape area. So we could create landscape change within 3 years and introduce cattle, get graziers in. And my model is based on charging the grazier no rent, maximising the value of the progeny, maximising the grant that we can get, and hopefully building a herd that's big enough and a market that's big enough that makes it a viable enterprise, but not enough for the farmer to live on. That's my model. Whether it works or not, I don't know. But I used to work for the Apprentice Commission, and we got into, as Rick knows, we got into very interesting debates when the South Downs National Park was being proposed as to whether, in fact, our recommendation was it wasn't wild enough and therefore it shouldn't be a national park. And I remember in a pub in London doing an exercise with my then boss, Marion Spain, as to how much it would cost us to buy the South Downs at twice its value, as opposed to having an agri-environment scheme for the next 20 years with no guarantee of what was going to happen in the future. And there's no question the cheapest thing to do is to buy the land.
Can I offer another model? And that is the Carafran type model, a community trust type acquisition and shares, people who buy that vision and feel there are different enterprises and spin-offs you could have from that environmentally rich land, and human enterprise and livelihoods and skills and learning.
I mean, the opportunity, which is interesting, and I'm conscious we're going on, but I do think it's a fascinating subject. There's been a number of farming surveys that have been done, one in Devon, I can't remember where the other one was done. Basically, key question asked to farmers with an average age of probably mid-50s, is your son going to take over the farm? Almost all of them said no, don't want to do this, too hard work, don't see the point, you're not earning an income, I'd rather earn money elsewhere. As has already been pointed out, in parts of the country we are seeing a radical change in land ownership. We are seeing contract farming on a big scale, people buying farmhouses, particularly around here, small dairy farms. Small dairy farms, 100 cows is far too small at the moment. So we're seeing dispersals of small farms. We're seeing new owners coming in, buying the farmhouse and buying the surrounding land quite often because they want to protect the farmhouse and the views, not knowing the first thing about farming and having some contract arrangement in. You could argue there's an opportunity in there, that you're actually dealing with people who don't have a tradition of farming in the family and so on.
Different motivations.
Different motivations. But again, as someone who's been a flag advisor in Oxfordshire, working with that type of person, they can be an absolute nightmare to work with because they have no sort of ground common sense, if you like. You know, they do things sometimes because they think it's the right thing to do, but they don't understand quite how the sort of countryside actually works. And going back to that whole succession thing, they don't understand what happens if you don't manage an area.
And it can be who gets to them first to influence them.
But I actually think if it was possible, the quickest way to achieve maybe some of these things is if the state or your suggested alternative model actually owned the land, because that's how we've been able to achieve so much in a short period of time here. If this project had been reliant on private landowners to do what we've done, the time frame would have been hugely extended, and you would have almost certainly got one or two awkward individuals who just did not want to play ball, so your connectivity is knackered.
Yes. Folks, we've got 40 minutes before we join those of us who are doing the Longhorn walk, join that. I want to thank Derek very much for coming and sharing his experience. I hope it's been useful for you, Derek. I know you've pulled all over the country, but we've certainly benefited from your experience. Any of you want to sort of make a point that we should reflect in the ECOS article on this? Can you speak to Peter or me while we're here today? Because we will be writing up something in ECOS to capture this, sort of rewilding where next or whatever. Thank you all very much for your inputs and commitment.